how did you first get interested in researching global warming?
Well, I've long been involved in atmospheric research, and I think I did my first work on climate issues about 50 years ago and published it in a long review article. And then I went on to other things. I went on to weather prediction and weather satellites, which is not exactly climate, because climate is long-term change. And I came back to climate issues, about 20 years ago.
Okay. And why do you think that so many scientists advocate global warming when their research shows otherwise?
Scientists are divided on this issue, it turns out. And let me talk about the scientific differences, although there are also ideological ones, because it's become a political issue, which is unfortunate. But from a scientific point of view, there are, I think, scientists who tend to believe in models and think there must be something wrong with the data, and those scientists who believe in the observations and think that the models are not adequate. So there's a basic split between, you might say, modelers and people who actually observe what's going on in the atmosphere.
Okay. And what do you think about the current media portrayal of global warming?
The media, unfortunately, are hyping the subject and are exaggerating the risks and are scaring the public. And I think that's very unfortunate, because it has important influences on the public and then in turn on politicians, and it kind of feeds back. So there's a kind of a circle, a vicious circle of media getting the public excited, the public beginning to get worried, politicians try to figure out what the public is thinking and then act accordingly. I don't think politicians really much care one way or the other as long as they get reelected.
Mm-hmm.
And that means they would like to be able to feel the pulse of the public. And although I must tell you that the public has become somewhat disenchanted with the subject and has become much more skeptical. And that has been shown in survey after survey in the past few years. But politicians have not caught up with that. And one reason is that there's money involved. It's unfortunate, but it's become a big business.
And why do you think that the media does this and it portrays global warming like it does?
Say again?
Do you think that there's a reason the media portrays global warming like this?
The media, I don't think, started out being one on one side or another, but they're always looking for things that are exciting and will sell newspapers or attract listeners. And they like catastrophes, disasters, things that get people excited. If you tell them, well, the climate is just what it was last year, or hasn't changed much, or it's cooling, and there's nothing to get excited about, well, that's not really news. But if you tell them something that sounds newsworthy, like climate is going to go through the roof, and in 10 years we won't be able to live anywhere except the Antarctic, maybe, that sort of sells papers.
Okay, and can you cite an example of this?
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that media, or journalists, shall we say, are too timid and too willing to listen to what they think are experts. They're too impressed by titles and by people. So, for example, when the president of the National Academy of Sciences tells them that, and he made this pronouncement just this past week, that the climate is changing faster than expected, they just write it down and report it. Now, if they were really curious and inquisitive, as they should be, like Rita Irvine was for accuracy in media, they would ask, well, on what basis did you make this expectation? And the only basis is, of course, on models. So then the journalist should say, well, are you telling me that the models are wrong? Or the models didn't anticipate what was going to happen? And the only answer then would be, yes, that's right, the models didn't anticipate that the climate is behaving differently from what the models predict. And then the journalist should ask, well, if that's the case, why should we believe the models now that are telling us about the future? if they couldn't tell us what was happening 10 years ago. You see, that is the kind of attitude we would like to have from the media, but unfortunately, the inquisitive or inquiring reporters seem to have gone. They've disappeared. They just take authority as their gospel, and they don't ask any further. For example, they don't ask, well, you say the climate is changing faster. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And when he says, well, you know, it's warming, then they should say, well, hasn't the climate cooled in the last 10 years? As the data show, as the thermometers show? And the only answer is yes, it has. Well, then why do you say it's changing faster? Well, you see, that is the kind of journalists we want. That is the kind of media we want. The media who will dig deep and expose hype, scare stories, and outright lies.
Okay, good points. And I read before you worked with the government, you worked in academia. And what was your favorite part about working in academia?
Oh, I've been both in government and in academia.
Mm-hmm.
In government, I did things like running the weather satellite program, and the most recent job I had was chief scientist of the Department of Transportation. I was concerned with technical issues,
Mm-hmm.
air traffic control and airline safety. But I'm basically an atmospheric physicist, and that's what I've been teaching and researching over the years. So I've been in a number of academic institutions and have always had students working with me, and we published lots of papers and did lots of theses, and it was a interesting and I think quite fruitful existence.
Okay. And did you incorporate your findings on global warming when you taught?
Well, I incorporate my work mainly in books now.
Okay.
I find it more convenient to wrap up my thoughts in a book rather than try to peddle each individual paper to a journal. It's getting very difficult because the journal editors have become tough people to deal with. They send it out to referees who are not very friendly. You see, if you try to publish something that does not go according to the common wisdom, you have a difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes publishing books much more attractive.
Do you think that college students are being misinformed about this topic?
Oh, students, well,
Yeah.
it depends on who they listen to, of course. Students are very
Mhm.
impressionable. At my university, at the University of Virginia, we have a strong contingent of faculty who are what you might call skeptics. We ask questions. We try to present both sides. So I think our students are somewhat more independent and better educated than students in places where they are fed the same old pap and the same old stories, and where they begin to think like their professors.
Okay. And at the recent NIPCC conference, you stated that money and power now overtake science. And do you think this can ever be reversed, and how?
You want to reverse what?
You said that money and power are now more important than science.
Oh, well, I did say that. It's true. The problem is that, and I think this is a bipartisan issue, which affects both Republicans and Democrats. George Bush, who actually did not believe that global warming was a real problem, and may have said so, acted as if it were. That is the issue. And he spent a lot of money on feeding people and issues and organizations that were propagandizing global warming. Maybe he was trying to buy them off. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
He started, for example, something called the hydrogen car. Crazy idea. It won't work. He is responsible for enlarging the ethanol program. He did many things to feed the fear of global warming, and by spending a lot of government money, he built up constituencies which have now become very strong. And it's very difficult now to change their ways. For example, farmers have discovered they can make a lot of money by growing corn and selling it to the people who make ethanol, which is an uneconomic and just a thoroughly bad idea. but it's now hard to fight the farm lobby. And the industrial lobby has decided that they can build windmills and make money on that.
Mm-hmm.
And the electric utilities have decided they can make money on it. So a lot of industries have now become convinced that they can make money on global warming, and they say, why fight it? Now, even though we know better, no use fighting it. We might as well ride with the waves and benefit from it.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Okay. And can you cite some of the errors that you found in An Inconvenient Truth?
Well, Al Gore published a book called Inconvenient Truth. It has so many errors, so many exaggerations, one doesn't know where to start. Some people have made a hobby out of looking for his errors. I think they cited 35 major errors. There was a court case in England where the judge defined 9 major errors and ruled that the book cannot be used in schools unless at the same time you also provide information that exposes these errors. It's futile. One can spend a lifetime on just finding errors in Al Gore's book and movie.
Okay. And do you think Al Gore is a hypocrite? You know, living in his big house, meanwhile saying preserve energy?
I don't want to throw stones at Al Gore. You know, he's discovered that he can make a very nice living out of global warming and at the same time be very popular. But it has to be pointed out that he doesn't live the sort of life that he recommends for everyone else. His carbon footprint is immense. His house, for example, in Tennessee, uses energy on a scale that corresponds to about 20 times the average. He travels around the world in private jets. You know, I don't blame him for this. He has a lot of money to spend, and it's his business of how he spends it. But he shouldn't be preaching to us, the rest of us, on how to live.
Okay.
Now, of course, many of us live a simple life just because we think it's the right thing to do. In my own case, for example, I've got rid of my car. I found I wasn't using it enough. So I followed Al Gore's advice, and I gave it away. And I came here by subway today. I took the metro. I walk whenever I can.
Mm-hmm.
If I have to, I will rent a car, but that's rare.
Okay, and do you think that this hypocrisy applies to a lot of Hollywood?
You can call them hypocrites, yes. It applies to many of them. If you look, for example, at the environmental organizations, and that's easy to do because their books are open, and check the salaries of the chief executives, you find that they're doing extremely well. Their salaries well exceed those of the President of the United States.
Wow.
There's at least a dozen of these environmental organizations that have fantastic salaries. They get them by scaring the public. That's their business. That's how they do it.
Okay.
That's how they raise money.
Can you tell me some of the major points from your new book, Climate Change Reconsidered?
Yeah, we just published a major book called Climate Change Reconsidered. When I say we, I should say I have a co-author who did much of the work, maybe most of the work. He's much younger, and he handles all the biological issues, and I am more of a physicist. His name is Craig Itzel. He's very good. And our book has just come out. It's 880 pages. It's very thick, and it's also very heavy. It makes a great paperweight. Seriously though, we published also a summary, which is only 40 pages, and I recommend to people that they read the summary, whose title is Nature, Not Human Activity, Rules the Climate. That's not only the title of our book, but it also tells the story. It tells the public, people who read this booklet of 40 pages, that climate change is natural and that the human influence is unimportant. So there's really nothing we can do about it. I've also written another book called Unstoppable Global Warming. It says that you can't do anything about it. It's natural. There are cycles of warming and cooling. By the way, we're now in a cooling cycle for about the last 10 years. Probably we'll go back into a warming cycle again. And so on. It depends on what time interval you take. As you know, we came out of an ice age only 10,000 years ago. We'll probably go back into another ice age within the next, I would say, 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years. We don't really know, but we'll certainly go back into another ice age.
Okay, and when did you start writing Climate Change Reconsidered?
The idea of writing a book to contradict or correct the established wisdom of the United Nations panel called the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that came about 2003, that's 6 years ago. We assembled a group of excellent scientists throughout the world. We met in Italy and decided on how to handle it. And then we met again in 2007, that's 2 years ago, and actually started writing. And we wrote the summary and the book in the last 2 years.
Okay. And last question is, do you think that the general public has an uninformed view on global warming?
The general public is in a tough position. When scientists disagree, it's hard for the general public to know who's right. How can they tell? In our book, particularly in the summary, which is addressed to the general public, more to the general public, we try to help them by pointing out that the data, the observations, disagree with the models. And then it's a matter of choice. Who do you believe? Do you believe in mathematical computer models, or do you believe in actual observations? We believe in observations, and we hope we convince people to believe in observations, and the observations show that the changes are natural and not human-caused.
Okay. And what do you attribute the general public's view on global warming to? Their uninformed view. What do you attribute this to?
Well, the general public are not scientists.
Mm-hmm.
They even have difficulty understanding graphs sometimes, and certainly don't understand statistics. But there's a good portion of the general public that is well educated, and you don't have to be an expert in the field to be able to find that there are logical fallacies. For example, let me give you one example. You hear a lot about glaciers melting. Ice is disappearing. And people say, oh my God, ice is disappearing, glaciers are melting. Calamity must be coming, we must do something. But when you think about it, logically, what does it tell you? All it tells you is that it's warming, or it has warmed. Glaciers, lag behind. They don't immediately melt. It takes for a long time for ice to melt. So you can get the same information from, and better information from thermometers.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need glaciers to determine temperatures. That's not how you measure temperature. And furthermore, when ice melts, it doesn't tell you the reason. It could be natural, or it could be man-made. So logically, it doesn't tell you anything. In other words, there's no need to get excited about melting glaciers, because it doesn't tell you what the cause is. And that idea, the logic, I think, is something we can get across to the public.
1